I remember the days before everything fell apart as if they were a different life. Susan and I had been together for 6 years, and from the outside, our marriage seemed perfect. We both put in the time and love to create a home, and when we decided to start a family, it felt like the final piece of the puzzle was falling into place. Our relationship wasn't without its challenges. My job often kept me away from home for weeks, and there was an unspoken loneliness between us that we never fully addressed. However, I believed we were strong enough to endure anything when Susan told me I was pregnant and really excited about becoming a father. It gave me a new sense of purpose, and I threw myself into preparing for the baby. We spent hours choosing names, painting the nursery, and planning for our future. I even started working closer to home to be more present for her and the baby. For months, life seemed to be going well, but I would soon find out that beneath the surface, things were already falling apart. The scene was almost perfect, like something from a nostalgic painting of family happiness. It wasn't the kind that would grace a magazine cover. My mother-in-law was on one side of the hospital bed, and my own mother was on the other, both watching Susan and our newborn daughter, who was breastfeeding. Newborns aren't conventionally cute, but to parents and grandparents they're perfect. As I watched, I couldn't deny that our daughter was indeed beautiful. Her skin had changed from blotchy red to soft pink, and the waxy coating from birth had been cleaned away. Even her head had rounded out, giving her a soft, angelic look. Her face had softened and rounded out, giving her a soft, angelic look. I had a feeling she would grow to look like her mother, Susan, my wife of 6 years, whom I had always seen as the love of my life. I quietly observed Susan nursing our baby while both our mothers offered unnecessary advice. Still, Susan seemed naturally skilled, likely thanks to the parenting classes we had attended, which thoroughly covered breastfeeding and newborn care. As I stepped aside, a nurse and another woman entered the room. "This is Miss Dinkin from administration. She's here to help you fill out the birth certificate application." The nurse, whose name I can't remember, told us in another situation that it's normal for a woman to nurse her baby without a shirt on. It might seem strange to others, but here it's normal. "Take your time and finish nursing your baby," Miss Jenkins said to Susan. "When you're ready, just fill in the highlighted sections. We probably already have most of the information we need in your hospital records. We just need to know your date and place of birth, but we'll also need both your full names, your maiden name, your ages, and a few other details. We'll take care of the rest and send it to the parish courthouse. You'll get a copy of the birth certificate in the mail in a couple of weeks. Honey, why don't you fill in the details?" "I'm a bit tied up right now," Susan said with a smile. No, I think I'll leave it to you for later, once you're not busy." I replied that we should probably wait until the DNA test results come back to confirm if I'm really the father. If this were a movie, you'd imagine the sound of a record needle screeching to a stop. Everything froze. 3 of the 4 women stared at me, mouths agape in shock. The 4th, the baby, was the only one not looking, but she was the only one who made a sound when her feeding was suddenly interrupted. Her cry barely covered the collective gasp. The law was the first to speak. "Are you out of your mind? Why would you even suggest something like that?" she shouted, glancing at Susan. Susan's face shifted from shock to confusion and then to anger. "How dare you accuse me of having someone else's baby? What kind of woman do you think I am?" Susan shot back. "Oh, I get it. It's April Fool's Day. You're pulling a prank on us. Well, it's not funny at all. You should know better." Her body language told a different story. Her shock was clear to see. I stood there watching her. I was completely serious. I said, "I'm not joking. There's a real chance I'm not the father. How could you possibly think I'd cheat on you? Have I ever given you any reason to suspect me? Name one time I've given you cause to think I'm seeing someone else," she demanded, ignoring her question. I continued, "So you're going with your usual response, deny, 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 and you're doing it with a straight face, too. I've got to say, I'm impressed." I turned to my mother. "I think I should move the car seat from my car to yours so you can take her and the baby home this afternoon. It would be great if you could stay with Susan for a while. You and Mom have offered to help before, but we thought we could manage on our own. She could really use the support since I won't be around." As I started to leave the room, I heard a firm command from behind. "Stop right there," my mother's voice demanded. I turned and faced her, bracing myself for what was coming. Both my mother and Susan exchanged worried glances, while Susan began sobbing uncontrollably. "You can't leave me and little Connie. She's our baby, you're her daddy," she cried. I addressed Susan. "I know I'm supposed to be the daddy, but am I actually the father? The difference is, my mom snapped me back to attention with a poke to my chest. She closed the small gap between us, grabbed the front of my shirt and pulled me close, locking eyes with me like she did when I was a kid. What on earth is wrong with you, Jason? Why this sudden stupidity? You can't back out of fatherhood now. It's done. You were thrilled when Sue told us she was pregnant. You've been devouring baby care books, buying and assembling the crib, changing table and everything for the nursery. You even painted it pink and yellow with cute little animals. Every week you bring home a new toy, some she won't use until she's walking. Mom paused, giving me a piercing look. So what's with the sudden change of heart? I've had a bit of an epiphany. I admitted I'm not as eager about this anymore. I'm sure you've noticed. Hey, Tony, my mother-in-law chimed in. We've all noticed you haven't held Connie or even really looked at her. We thought the reality of being a dad was just sinking in. What's going on? If that baby's mine, I'll do everything to take care of her and be a great father. I declared this so intensely that both my mother and Tony stepped back. I was fully committed, but that changed last week when I found out I might not be the father. I'm not bonding with a child I won't be raising. I'll provide for her if she's mine, but if not, Clive Adams can take responsibility for his own child, I said loudly. At the mention of that name, Susan suddenly cried out, Clive and I never did anything. We've never been physical or engaged. How can you accuse me of that? I moved closer to the foot of her bed. Mom and Tony exchanged glances, their eyes darting between Susan and me. You're still going to deny that you had an affair with him? You had an affair for almost 6 months and only ended it 7 months ago after finding out you were pregnant and telling him. From what I've heard, he told you to make sure I never found out. Susan's face flushed. We absolutely did not. Anyone who says otherwise is lying. Who is Clive Adams and who told you about this? Tony demanded, his voice rising. I want to know who's spreading lies about my daughter. Ignoring the first question, I answered the second. Clive Adams himself. Susan, Clive told me everything. He was under a lot of pressure at the time and he let it all out in the middle of his screams. I said that's nonsense. Clive was just fine when he called me yesterday to check on me and the baby. Her exhaustion after giving birth was apparent, and she may not have realized the slip-up, but her words hit us all. Tony slumped a bit and I glanced at my mother, who was wide-eyed. I could see she was taking it all in. So, you're still in touch with your old flame, I said. Did he give you more advice on how to keep me in the dark about him possibly being the father? Susan broke down into sobs. Her crying was so intense that 2 nurses rushed into the room. We were so careful. There was no way you could have known. No one. I knew Susan was just a little overwhelmed. I told the first nurse, who shot me a protective glare on behalf of her patient. I suppose my tone might have sounded odd to her. We were just discussing potential fathers to put on the birth certificate application. The nurse continued to look at me with suspicion. It seems like she's expecting me to fill in my name, but I'd rather wait until we know for sure if I'm the father or if it's the guy she was seeing when she got pregnant. I could tell by the nurse's expression that she was starting to understand. She turned her attention to comforting Susan. Cheryl, let's calm down now. Remember the breathing techniques you used during labor. Cheryl will get something to help you relax if you need it, but let's try natural methods first. We don't want anything passing into your milk, so let's start with some deep breathing. Inhale with me deeply as I watched the nurse soothing Susan. I didn't notice my mom and mother. Your in-law is approaching you. You need to explain what's going on. My mom whispered sharply. I was startled. Mom rarely spoke this way, but she'd done it twice today. Clearly something big was happening. Judging by Sue's reaction, my mother-in-law added, I want to know the full story, what, when, and how. This is completely unexpected. Well, it should be obvious, I replied, glaring at both women. I was getting annoyed that I was the target of their frustration, not Susan. She was involved with a colleague when she got pregnant. At least one other man besides me. I can't say for sure if there were more. Susan pulled herself together. Surprisingly fast, considering she'd seemed on the verge of a breakdown just moments earlier. We were so careful, she asked, her voice filled with desperation. How I saw the same questioning look from my mom and Tony. They were eager to know more. Yes, you were very discreet. I had no idea. Neither did anyone else. I admitted, but Clive, being the charming seducer, he couldn't resist bragging. He needed to show off his latest conquest. You know, Cheryl Watkins, I asked, and Susan nodded. Cheryl had been her coworker for years. Cheryl and her husband Steve were part of our social circle. Well, Clive almost convinced Cheryl to meet him at a hotel. Her biggest fear was that he might talk, and her husband would find out. She wasn't sure she could trust him to stay quiet, so to prove he could keep a secret, he spilled the details of his past relationships. Whatever you want to call them, he dropped a few names and gave enough details to make her believe him. He even asked if she could guess who else he'd been involved with. Excluding his public girlfriends were either married women or single women from work. Of course, she couldn't think of any, so to further convince her, he mentioned some women from the office she knew. The one before you was Sandy. She backed out after a few months when her husband got suspicious. Then it was you for 6 months, but you ended things when you found out you were pregnant. Clive told Cheryl, we were hoping your husband was the baby's father, but he wasn't willing to keep the affair going. He made sure Cheryl understood how crucial it was that your husband, meaning me, never found out because he thought I might leave you and not want to deal with child support during that time. You were very open about your pregnancy. You were happy and shared the news with everyone. I could see from your reaction at work that you were excited about the baby, but you didn't seem to care who the father was. You assumed I wouldn't ask about it and that I'd stick with the child even if I had doubts. I wasn't comfortable with that, so I paused to let my words sink in. Susan sat in silence, her face betraying her emotions. She tried to hide Tony, but Mom listened closely, taking in every word. They both wanted answers, and I was just as curious as she was. As it turned out, Lana Richard was Clive's next mistress. Her husband grew suspicious when she suddenly started working late, so she had to be careful. She ended up being late to pick up their youngest from daycare a few times because of this disruption in his routine. Clive turned his attention to Cheryl and managed to win her over again, just as I said he would. He's a smooth talker, telling her exactly what she wants to hear to win her over. He's also quite skilled in bed, keeping his married partner satisfied and coming back for months. Tony and Mom exchanged glances, then turned to Susan. How exactly did Cheryl end up confessing? Mom asked, trying to piece everything together. So, it wasn't intentional. I explained that Cheryl's quite vocal during closeness. I added that she accidentally called out Clive's name, which made her husband Steve push her about it. She ended up confessing, and she chuckled, recalling the story Steve had shared over a beer. Cheryl wasn't one for primal noises like Susan. Steve said that Cheryl liked to say exactly what she wanted during closeness. One night, Cheryl shouted, "Give it to me, Clive. I love it." Steve knew Clive and was aware of his reputation as a womanizer. He figured it out and confronted Cheryl. That's how he explained it to me, Mom. Tony seemed shocked by the details. He and Larry, Lana's husband, couldn't hide their reactions when Larry found out. Larry's a police officer, so this is a tricky situation. He kept quiet for a week, waiting for the baby to arrive before taking any action. We didn't want to put any extra stress on Susan in her final stages. Now that the baby is here, we need to be upfront about what Clive has done and the fallout that comes with it. Tony's face turned pale, and he looked disbelieving. So you're telling me this Clive Adams was involved with several women, including my daughter? There's a chance Connie is his, she asked, her voice shaking with anger and disappointment. Yes, I know. Clive has no idea, or maybe he does and just doesn't care about the damage he's caused. There was a moment of silence before my mom finally spoke. What's the next step? I sighed, feeling the weight of my decisions. I've already submitted a DNA test. I spoke with the head nurse the day after the baby was born. Since Susan and I are married, I need her consent to test the baby. I decided to go for an expedited test, so we'll know the results in 2 to 3 days. Tony asked if I could forgive Sue and move on, even if I'm not the baby's biological father. I noticed she called the child the baby instead of using her name. That's a small but telling shift from her. Tony was pretty perceptive and could read me well, but it was clear she still held on to some hope. Glancing at my mom, I saw that she had already figured out my feelings. While she understood, she wasn't happy about it. To be honest, I'm not sure I can move past this, even if I am the father. I admitted I've had just over a week to process it. This wasn't a one-time thing. It was a mistake, like a drunken fling. It was a 6-month thing. I can't trust her anymore. She didn't just disrespect me in our marriage. She risked getting pregnant by that guy while we were actively trying for a baby. She told the whole family that we decided to conceive her continued affair with Clive. This shows me she didn't care who the father of her child was. Have you considered couples therapy? My mom interjected, possibly trying to cut off any arguments from Susan's family. And let's not forget the baby. It's not her fault the little girl will need a father. Even if you're not her biological dad, you could still be her daddy. I sighed again, like I said earlier, Mom. I doubt therapy will help. What I really want to understand is where I went wrong as a husband. There had to be something I did or didn't do that led Susan to betray me. It's not like she was looking for a reason to replace me. Clive's a known womanizer. He'd never commit to her, and I'm sure she knew that. I shook my head, feeling the frustration rising. I'm trying not to say the hard things that are on my mind. Neither of them deserves my anger right now, but I'm on edge and close to snapping. Aside from the physical attraction or maybe some thrill, I can't see any other reason for this. I thought our relationship was strong. I was strong, and both women listened quietly as I continued. You can imagine how shattered I've been since I found out. Just like you said, Mom, I was so excited about becoming a father. Then, out of nowhere, everything collapsed. My entire world fell apart. Honestly, at this point, I almost hope I'm not the father. Both women seemed surprised by my admission. That way, I wouldn't have to deal with being a part of this. Time, Dad. To be honest, I'm not sure I can handle interacting with Susan, even if the baby is mine. That's going to take a lot of therapy. Just then, the nurse came out of the room and said, Mr. Font, your wife wants to speak with you. She mentioned that she knows you're still here. Otherwise, her mother would have returned by now. She seemed to convey some sympathy toward my feelings, at least that's how it appeared. But she stopped me before I could head back in. If you do go in, I hope you can stay calm. I understand you're upset, but please try not to upset her further. We'd rather avoid using sedation, which she's scheduled for discharge this afternoon. It wouldn't be ideal to give her extra medication that could pass to the baby through her milk. Based on your childbirth classes, I'm sure you know how important colostrum and early breast milk are for the baby's immune system. I nodded, realizing she was appealing to my concern for the baby's well-being. It doesn't matter whose child it is. Maybe you should go and have a word with her mom. I'll grab some coffee and Tony can move the car seat. I'll wait for you to finish. Oh, and before you leave, why not swing by the nursery and take a good look at Connie? She looks a lot like you when you were. Are you just seeing what you want to see, or is it wishful thinking? I asked. She just shrugged, clearly unhappy with the situation. I knew that if I was the father, she would be deeply involved in helping raise the baby, regardless of what happened between Susan and me. Mom was already invested in her role as a grandmother, just as I was. I'd been preparing for fatherhood, and it was obvious she hadn't fully accepted the possibility that the baby might not be her grandchild. I went into the room, and as soon as Susan saw me, she started crying again. You must hate me, she said. No, I don't hate you, I replied. I hate what you did. I'm so angry I can barely think straight. I wanted to shake her and storm out, but I had to stay and get answers. Do you really want to talk now, or would you prefer a few extra days to figure out how to explain this? I asked, my tone clearly indicating my frustration. Susan began. I don't need days. I interrupted her, though I wanted answers. You've had 9 months to think about what to say if I ever found out you were cheating with Clive Adams of all people. My voice shook as I said his name, Clive Adams. I repeated it, pausing to take a few deep breaths. No, I didn't think. He might be the father. That was me. I thought I was having our baby, not his. Susan defended herself. You might be the father, but it seems doubtful. I shot back. She looked genuinely shocked. Oh, come on. I was still offshore on a rig during the first week of July when you supposedly got pregnant. I checked my work schedules to be sure. I remember coming home near the end of the week, and we made up for lost time. We were physical right away, just like usual. That's when I thought you got pregnant. That's what I told the guys at work. I had no idea Clive was in the... As soon as Susan started to protest, I interrupted again. What about the weeks before that? Right until I got off the helicopter, did you have him over while I was away? Did you move him in? Did you sleep with him in our bed? I kept going, letting the questions flow. It doesn't matter where you did it. Susan said that apart from the few occasions we hosted barbecues and invited colleagues from work, he never came to the house. We were careful not to risk neighbors seeing him or his car parked at the house, but we weren't careful enough to avoid getting pregnant. So, you can't say the rubber broke, I said coldly. Clive seems like he's the type to take risks or at least push boundaries as long as he benefits. I got tested for STDs this past week, so I suggest you get screened too. Susan muttered softly. That was part of my early pregnancy exams. I was a little surprised as I didn't think that was routine, so I told my doctor I wanted to make sure. You hadn't caught something while you were away on business, she admitted. I felt my face flush with anger. So, your OBGYN thinks I might have been the one cheating. Instead of telling the truth, you let her believe that I had more questions and I needed answers. Why did you cheat, and why with him? Why would you do that? You could get pregnant with Clive. Why not just go back on birth control and wait longer to have a baby? You could sleep with him without the risk. Susan looked down. I don't know. I was lonely when you were away. I was aroused and Clive was there. We started talking and before I knew it, we were already close. I knew he wasn't looking for anything serious. She hesitated, clearly struggling with the next part. As for why I didn't go back on birth control, I was already seeing Clive before we decided I'd stop taking it. He refuses to use condoms, so I take a shower afterwards to lower the risk a little. I know. It wasn't the safest method, but I thought it was the best option. I muttered sarcastically, Keeping your legs closed would have been a better option. Susan looked shocked, and I hoped she wouldn't shut down before I got more answers. So, you cheated on me for about 4 months before getting pregnant and then kept it. After I asked, we talked for another 2 months. Susan nodded. I thought I might be pregnant, but I didn't want to stop seeing him until I was sure. I figured if I was already pregnant, it didn't matter if I kept seeing him. She winced at her choice of words. Clive ended things. After I told him about the baby, she admitted that he didn't want to risk you finding out and having to be responsible if the baby was his. So you two talked about your options. I said that we both thought you'd never suspect that Connie wasn't yours. She said quietly that there was a good chance she wasn't his, especially. Since you came home that first week in July, we were together all the time, and I didn't see Clive at all when you were home. So you had a relationship with Clive while I was away working to support us in the life we wanted. I said, was it out of resentment because I wasn't around, or I was almost tempted to ask the harsher question, but I held back. Susan quickly shook her head, trying to dismiss the implications. No, it wasn't like that, she insisted. It was purely physical. I felt desire when you were away. Clive and I only had physical closeness when you were out of town. We met at his place 3 or 4 evenings. For a week, we were careful. I didn't stay overnight every time and tried to make it seem like I was mostly home. We never showed any affection at work that would suggest we were more than friendly colleagues. Her words sounded rehearsed, as if she had been justifying it to herself for a long time. And no, he's not better. She added, sensing my unspoken questions, that we hadn't done anything and that she didn't normally do it. It was just that he was there when I wasn't around and it was fun and exciting. That's the best way to put it, and she was honest about it. I was really hurt. It felt like she was justifying the affair to herself. I clenched my jaw and said, if you were only mine when I was around, you were never really mine. I tried to keep my voice steady. You were my wife, but his mistress. You were so careful not to get caught, but then you got pregnant. I added bitterly, I guess you never thought about what would happen if I found out later that our oldest child wasn't mine. Maybe because of a blood type difference, or if she didn't look like our other kids. That's assuming you didn't cheat again and let another man father your next child, or go back to Clive for... No, I promised I'd never cheat on you again. I knew once you bonded with Connie you'd never leave her, even if she wasn't biologically yours. Just look at how you've already been with her. You're fully devoted to that baby. Even Clive agrees with me on this one. I said sarcastically, you and Clive have been talking about the possibility that he is the father. He called yesterday to check on you, and it's obvious you two discussed how to manage me, keep me in the dark, and plan for my reaction. Susan started to fidget, clearly uncomfortable. The key word here is, I was invested in being that baby's daddy, I said coldly. Both mums noticed that I haven't held her, changed her nappy, swaddled her, or even taken more than a quick look at her from afar. I'll make an effort to change that if the DNA test shows I'm the father. After all, I looked her straight in the eye. I want to ask you something. Did it ever really matter to you whether I was the father or Clive? Susan didn't deny it. She said that, of course, she wanted you to be the father, but that once she found out she was pregnant, she just wanted the baby. She knew it would be adorable and that you wouldn't suspect anything. You and Clive, you look pretty similar to me. Same hair color, similar build. You'd be her daddy and it wouldn't matter. I felt a bit bitter. You know I've been spending less time offshore recently. I gave up some of that big bonus money and started spending more time in the office managing things from there. I even took a pay cut. You seemed happy. I was home more, or at least that's what I thought. If my being away was such a problem, you should have spoken up long ago. All you had to do was ask. Everything I did was for you. Susan began crying again, but this time it didn't affect me. Well, that's about to change. If I'm not the father, you seemed happy that I was home more, or at least that's what I thought. If my being away was such a problem, you should have spoken up long ago. All you had to do was ask. Everything I did was for you. Susan began crying again, but this time it didn't affect me. Well, that's about to change if I'm not the father. I'm going back to the rigs. I'll stay out there until I find a woman who actually wants to be with me and only me. I'm not interested in someone who can't keep her vows or her legs closed when I'm not around. I said angrily. Her tears continued, but they barely registered with me. I need you to help take care of the baby. She sobbed. We're a family. What about us? We've done so well these past 7 months. I've been a devoted wife. I haven't looked at another man since then. We could try counseling right now. I'm not sure they're still on. We'll figure things out if the DNA test shows I'm the father. But for now, I'm not staying here, not until I get those results. I'll get those results when I get back. I've already packed up the things that matter to me. Her face showed pure shock as she stared at me, disbelieving. Where will you go? she asked softly, her voice trembling with fear. I've rented an apartment. I arranged it last week. I wanted to wait until the baby was born before leaving, I said coldly. Tony will stay with you for now, and maybe my mom will help too. She's hoping it's her grandchild. I turned and walked out of the room. Susan continued crying, though not as intensely as before. On my way out, I nearly ran into Tony and my mother, who had clearly been eavesdropping by the door. Yeah, I heard you. Sue me, Tony said bitterly, but don't give up hope. There's still a chance for reconciliation, especially if Connie is your daughter. I turned to her, my voice sharp. You claim you were listening, but did you miss the key points? Like the fact that she never once apologized for cheating. She doesn't feel any guilt. She justifies it by saying she was lonely and aroused. It seems like she thinks that excuses everything. She didn't even care whether I'm the father or not. She just expects me to deal with it and accept everything. That's just disgusting. Tony looked stunned by my intensity, her eyes filled with tears. I stepped in to try to calm things down. I moved the car seat and secured it. She said gently, I'm going to pack a bag and stay for a few days, even if you're not the father. Sue has been like a daughter to me for the last 6 years. I can't just abandon her, not yet at least. But don't get me wrong, I don't condone what she did. I'm angry too, if she hadn't just had a baby. I think Tony and I would both tell her how foolish she's been. I nodded, appreciating her honesty when they asked. I shared the location of my new apartment, but didn't mention that I had already consulted a lawyer and taken steps to protect my share of the assets. I had settled our credit card debts and secured our investment accounts. I even instructed the lawyer too. I was going to prepare divorce papers citing infidelity, even though it isn't recognized in our state. Susan would be homebound for a few days, so I couldn't risk her accessing our finances online. I took precautions. I was almost certain our marriage was beyond repair. The small bit of doubt I had, based on the happiness we'd once shared, vanished completely. I trusted her again. On my way to my new apartment, I called Steve for a drink. I'd planned to take a few weeks off work after the baby was born to help my wife adjust. It was like a male version of maternity leave. But right now, I didn't want to be alone. Steve had a flexible schedule, so he met me at the bar he worked at with his father. I'll get back to you on that. I figured he wouldn't be there much longer, especially after Cheryl's confession. I spoke to Susan, and Steve asked me to pass on the details of our conversation. I've consulted the same lawyer you did. I was lucky that Cheryl's father insisted on a prenuptial agreement when we got married. He wanted to protect his business, while Cheryl has some stock she doesn't get dividends from, or have any real influence. She'll keep the stock, but I'll get nearly everything else we discussed. Steve knew Susan would be entitled to half of our shared assets, which was a significant amount. We'd both contributed financially to the marriage, with Susan earning a good salary. I was hoping to stir things up enough to avoid paying her alimony. I thought Tony might. I'm not sure I'll be paying child support, as I don't think the baby is mine. I'm going to have to pay for this, I grumbled. I'm sure the courts will punish me even though I did nothing wrong. Steve nodded, and Larry and I went to see Dawn Duckett's husband. I told him about her affair with Clive. He said he was furious. Larry, being a cop, warned him not to do anything reckless. I nodded. Don was also upset with us. He couldn't believe we were just going to let Clive get away with making a fool of us. He called us weak for not confronting Clive right away. Larry surprised me by saying, "Who said anything about letting that idiot off easy?" I told Don not to do anything stupid. I told him not to do anything that would get him caught. Clive isn't worth going to jail over just because he acted impulsively. Don may be quick-tempered, but he's not dumb. Steve said he was level-headed, but not dumb. I added that I just needed to make sure I didn't get caught when someone dealt with Clive. We joked about it, and he calmed down enough to listen. I chuckled. Yeah, we know something has to be done about that idiot. Clive needs to be dealt with. We need to do this carefully. Castrating him isn't the answer. Steve gave me a baffled look. You must be out of your mind. He said he can't just walk away from this. Even if he can't have more kids, he still has financial responsibilities. He's accountable for destroying marriages. Yours, mine, and probably Don's. Larry might stay with Lana for now because of their kids, but he'll decide later. Heck has been putting it off because of you. Well, Clive's lies will start falling apart once these women I told him, but I don't think he'll stick around for long. The problem is that he's too easy to track. People don't realize how hard it is to disappear completely. You can't make the kind of money Clive wants while staying off the grid. He's in trouble. Trust me, but if we already know about 4 women he's been with, there are probably more. I bet there are more women he's been with. It's like looking for needles in a haystack. If you shake the hay, 4 needles fall out. There must be more in the whole stack. We need to track down other husbands who might be angry with him too, I added. Steve laughed at the metaphor. As for punishing him, I'd prefer he keeps at least one testicle intact and undamaged. Steve looked puzzled. Why just one? I explained that if he loses both, he could still take hormone replacements and keep having sex. But if you leave him with one, we could damage it, perhaps causing him some lasting discomfort would stop him repeating his behavior without resorting to anything extreme. Plus, it'd mess with him psychologically. Steve laughed, knowing he'd eventually share my idea with Larry and Don. He'd already spoken to them and knew they'd get the humor. 2 days later, I stopped by the house where Susan and I used to live. Tony answered the door. You didn't waste any time, did you? What do you want? She asked bitterly. Susan got the divorce papers this morning. I'm sorry, I said, feeling a mix of guilt and relief. She's been crying non-stop. Since then, the only time she seems okay is when she's caring for Connie. I can't really blame you, but I thought you'd hold off. She's really upset. I doubt she'd even consider another relationship after all this. Do you think there is any chance for reconciliation if you both go to counseling? Tony asked, still holding on to hope. I shook my head. I already knew there was no future for us as a couple, and this just confirms it. I handed her the paternity test report. The baby isn't mine. Tony looked at the envelope, tears streaming down her face. She was heartbroken. The weight of her shattered hopes and dreams hit her hard. After a final hug, she turned to tell her daughter the news. I'd already told my own mother. She was upset at losing the chance to be a grandmother. She was angry about Susan's infidelity. She'd chosen to stay home and not be with Tony and Susan while waiting for the DNA results. She was also a victim of Susan's and Clive's betrayal. The whole town was talking about it. In the days that followed, Steve, Larry, Dawn, and I confronted our wives. We didn't hold back on naming Clive, and we made a point of exposing his actions. None of us liked the label of betrayed, but we stood firm and shared how our wives had fallen for his charm and strategy. It seemed like he was boasting about his past conquests to Cheryl, and the other women were influenced by his smooth talk. Despite their seemingly happy marriages, they were drawn in by Clive's charm and enjoyed what he had to offer as his affairs became public knowledge. Fathers of babies born to women linked to him started demanding paternity. I later heard that he'd fathered 2 more children. Suspicious husbands started asking their wives about their activities, and some couples even sought counseling. The full extent of his actions remained hidden until he confessed directly to the police. You'd think someone living the life Clive chose would keep his assets liquid. He was ready to flee at a moment's notice, but instead of converting his high income into cash, stocks, or easily transferable assets, Clive decided to buy a house and invest in multiple real estate properties. Even his home furnishings were extravagant, with valuable artwork on the walls alongside the typical hunting and fishing gear common in our area. The area where he lived had everything he needed for water skiing and fishing. Even if Clive had managed to sell his assets and flee, law enforcement could still have tracked him down. It's hard to completely disappear when your social security number is needed for any high-income no matter how far you run, a cash job is risky. Clive didn't fully grasp the danger he was in. He severely underestimated the anger of the husbands. Instead of leaving the area right away, he stayed and paid the price. Just a few days after word of his affair spread, Clive was found on the sidewalk near his house during his morning jog. He was in shock and barely conscious. A passing jogger found him and immediately called an ambulance. She couldn't cut the straps binding his arms behind his back, so she wisely stopped when she tried to roll him over, and he screamed. When the paramedics arrived, they discovered his groin had been crushed with a I heard this story from Larry, the police officer at the bar. He told Steve, Dawn, and me both seriously and in a joking manner that 2 detectives had once told him that if he ever had a 3B hammer with mysterious tissue on it, he should toss it into the swamp. I wasn't involved in what happened to that guy's manhood, but I'm just passing along what my fellow officers told me, Larry said with a wink and a barely concealed smirk. Clive had no idea who attacked him. I remember hearing his doorbell ring, but I'm not sure if it was late the night before or early that morning. It was dark and I had been asleep. I think they used a taser. Clive told investigators they shocked him a few times. I remember that there might have been. I think there were 2 of them, but I'm not sure. I was pretty out of it. One of them said something about not going after another man's wife. After that, it was just unbearable pain. I was understandably desperate to see his attackers brought to justice. Clive gave the investigator the names of every woman he had been involved with over the past few years, married or otherwise. The list was surprisingly long, with so many leads to follow. The investigation became complicated despite numerous suspects. There was no solid evidence pointing to anyone, and because the timing of the attack was unclear, it was tricky to get confirmation privately. Larry told Steve and me that the detectives thought Clive Adams had got what he deserved after a few months. The investigation stalled and reached a dead end as expected. Susan got half of our shared property. The house was sold and a new family moved in, bringing their young daughter into the nursery. I'd painted the nursery with little animal designs, hoping she'd appreciate the care I'd put into it. Susan moved back to her mother's house as she struggled to care for the baby. At least with Tony, she wouldn't be lonely. I had no interest in her romantic life anymore. Susan called me once to apologize, likely after Tony pressured her. However, she didn't clarify what she was apologizing for. It could have been for the infidelity, getting pregnant by another man, or for me finding out and divorcing her. I didn't ask at the time. I had moved on when she suggested meeting to talk. I declined. She also asked if I knew about Clive's situation and whether I had any involvement. I simply said he got what he deserved and ended the call. I often wondered how much it would cost Susan to get Clive to pay child support. He wouldn't do it willingly, so she'd have to go to court. She'd eventually get it, but hiring a lawyer would drain her savings. Clive was facing several similar lawsuits. I heard steps were being taken to stop him from selling his real estate. Between his medical bills, legal fees, and upcoming child support obligations, he wouldn't have much left. That's assuming he could keep his job. 18 months later, at 3 in the morning, I stood leaning against the lower rail of the Econ 626 rig in the Gulf of Mexico. The cool autumn breeze was refreshing and my lightweight windbreaker kept me warm. It was one of my last routine visits to the rigs. I had met a woman and decided she was worth pursuing. We had a great connection, but I wasn't sure where it would lead. I was ready to move on. I unzipped my jacket and felt the weight of the lump hanging over my belt. I'd tried to get rid of it many times, but I couldn't bring myself to let go. The risk of keeping it made no sense, but it gave me a strange feeling of comfort. It was like I had reclaimed a part of myself without thinking about it. I pulled out the heavy hammer from its hiding place and threw it into the sea. After that moment in the hospital when I walked out on Susan and Connie, the world seemed to slow down. Everything felt detached, like I was watching my life. I was just a bystander to the wreckage I had helped create. The days turned into a blur, each one feeling like a burden heavier than the last. Work was my salvation, if you could call it that, but even the rig, which had once felt like a second home, became a place where I couldn't escape my own thoughts. I rented a small apartment not far from the house where we used to live. It was cold and impersonal, like a motel room. I stayed in it for a few nights and then moved on. I didn't furnish it much, as I spent most of my time out of the place anyway. If I wasn't at work, I was at the bar, nursing beers and nursing my broken pride. It's funny how things fall apart. Everything fell apart all at once, like a dam bursting after the smallest crack. Susan and I had been doing our best, hadn't we? Or was that just my version of the story? Maybe I'd been blind all along, ignoring the signs because I didn't want to admit that our marriage had cracked long before Clive slithered his way in for weeks after leaving. I thought about whether I should meet Connie again. My mother kept asking if I'd seen the baby yet, as if seeing her would make me forget everything. But how could I look at her without wondering if she really was mine? I'd told myself I'd stay away until the DNA results came back, but even after they confirmed what I'd feared, that I wasn't the father, I couldn't stay away from the father. There was this part of me that was still drawn to her and the baby. I had prepared for this life, and I felt like I was abandoning not just Susan, but a part of myself. I did eventually go back, not for Susan, but for Connie. It wasn't some big emotional reunion. There were no grand gestures. I walked in. Tony handed me the baby without a word, and I sat down on that same couch where I had once imagined our family's future, holding her. It wasn't the catharsis I had hoped for. I stared down at her tiny face, and all I could see was Clive's betrayal, Susan's lies. Connie was innocent in all of it, sure, but that it didn't make it easier, and it didn't make me forget. Tony's voice pulled me out of my thoughts, reminding me that I couldn't escape reality forever. "You're not the father," she said quietly but firmly, as if she were trying to convince herself just as much as me. "You don't owe anything." I left without looking back after that day. I made a conscious decision. I tried to move on by getting stuck into work. Anything that kept my mind busy was good. I took the job at headquarters, which I'd been offered months ago. I traded in my time offshore for a desk job in the city. The rhythm of office life was different, but no matter how far I went, I couldn't outrun the echoes of what had happened. But something strange started to happen as time went on. I met someone new. Her name was Lily, and she was unlike anyone I'd ever known. There was a quiet strength to her, a calmness I didn't realize I needed until it was there. We met through mutual friends, and what started as casual dinners turned into something deeper. She didn't push me to. I told Lily about what had happened with Susan. Thankfully, she was there for me when I needed to talk, even if all I could offer were bits and pieces of a broken story. Things were different with Lily. She made me believe in a future where the past didn't have to define me. I found myself opening up slowly and cautiously, and she in turn trusted me with her own. She was able to move on from her own experiences, and it wasn't perfect, but it was. After everything, I realized that maybe that was enough. It's been 3 years since I left the hospital. Susan and I never spoke again, except through lawyers. Connie is someone else's responsibility now, and I've come to accept that I still think about her sometimes, but less often. As for Clive, he got what was coming to him. I'll admit there are still nights when I think about the hammer, what it meant, why I kept it for so long. Maybe it was my way of holding on to control, of reminding myself that even though everything fell apart, I wasn't completely powerless. But when I finally let it go, I threw it into the sea, and it felt like a release, like a final goodbye to the man I used to be. Now I'm with Lily, and I'm learning to be someone better. The scars are still there, but they don't define me. I'm not the man who lost everything. I'm the man who chose to rebuild. For the first time in a long time, I think that's enough.